It may be one of the more commonly failed maneuvers, and I'll tell you as an examiner, man, a lot of them are ugly that I see. But I'll tell you as an examiner, I can usually tell in the first 45 degrees of your turn if we're going to botch this or not.
That's examiner Jason Blair talking about lazy eights, which he says is the maneuver pilots are most likely to fail on the commercial Checkride. And if you're thinking, well, that doesn't apply to me, I'm never going to get a commercial certificate, we'll first talk about good reasons for any pilot to get the commercial certificate. And then Jason will talk us through how to fly each of the commercial Checkride maneuvers and tell us as an examiner what he's looking for on a Checkride. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. Last week in episode 148, we talked about understanding the subtleties of aircraft weight and balance. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. And if you have found value in any of our shows, please support us with just a small donation through our Patreon page at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Or if you have a PayPal account, please make a one-time or monthly contribution through PayPal at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And when you do, we'll read your name on the show. You'll find links in the show notes to both of those. And just a quick note, if you haven't done so already, please click that subscribe button in whatever app you're listening to us now on your phone. Not only will it download each new show when it's available, but it will also boost our rankings, making it more likely that other people will find the show. And it costs nothing to hit that subscribe button, so please do it now. Now here's our conversation with Jason Blair. And now let me tell you a little bit about Jason Blair. Jason is an FAA DPE, that's a designated pilot examiner. He gives check rides to pilots. He's also an active flight instructor. He writes for both flying and plane and pilot magazines. He's the past executive director of NAFI, the National Association of Flight Instructors, and he served on a number of industry committees. He's also one of our supporters who donates each month through a Patreon to support the Aviation News Talk. And you may remember him from episode 139, where he gave me a private mock check ride. Jason, welcome back. Good to have you here again.
Glad to be back, and certainly got some good time to think about great questions, as many of us have slowed down a little bit for these future commercial check rides. And I even thought of a few good ones for your mock one here today as we think about it. We'll see if we can stump you a little bit, and maybe you stump me back a little bit even.
Well, and I think we'll also get more into the maneuvers as well, too. But, let's just talk a little bit about the commercial to begin with. I think a lot of pilots get their private, they get their instrument, and they go, hey, I'm done. What are some of the reasons somebody might want to get a commercial certificate?
The most obvious one is that they want to pursue a career and get paid to do this flying stuff, which is also pretty cool. Maybe they want to be an instructor. Maybe they want to end up in an airline. Maybe they want to fly for a local 135 operator. Maybe they want to fly some agricultural flying. That's pretty cool stuff too. Sometimes you see people out there flying and spraying. There's a lot of really great reasons you might want to get that commercial pilot certificate. And even if you don't plan on using this certificate as a job, it might just be a way to enhance some of your own skills, build some extra skills along the way, and in some cases, get a little bit of an insurance discount. So there's lots of great reasons, even if you're not going to be a pro pilot, to get that commercial certificate.
I like that last reason, which I'll summarize as just because. Because it's out there. It's a way to up your skills, to get a little bit more proficient. And I got to tell you, I did my commercial for just that reason, just because, hey, it's the next thing out there. And I was so lucky I did, because years later when somebody said, hey, you should become a CFI, it was like, oh, I can do it. If I hadn't done that, I would have had to first get my commercial and then start working on the CFI.
Max, I did the exact same thing back when I was in college. I had a private pilot license when I was in high school. And while I was in college staying current, I did an instrument rating. And I thought, man, you got to stay current for some reasons, right? You might as well do something useful and get some more training. And I got the commercial. And then lo and behold, the CFI seemed like the next thing. And here we are 20, 25 years later. It's a career. Amazing how sometimes that path kind of happened. So you never know. Just getting that commercial certificate might lead you on a different path towards some professional flying, even if you don't plan on it right now.
Well, true. And it opens up all kinds of doors later on. I was just thinking, for example, I am happy that I got my pressurized endorsement for a high altitude, because otherwise I would have been in trouble when I started doing jet work. It's like, hey, that's already done and taken care of. So yeah, I think just going out there and adding additional ratings makes a whole lot of sense.
I agree. And just even more training all the way along as we enhance those skill bases makes us better, more well-rounded pilots, and probably a little bit safer along the way too.
Oh, I like to think so. Well, let's start by talking about some of the training requirements for the commercial Checkride. I know there's some that trip people up a little bit. Tell us a little bit about the things that people have to have done from an experience standpoint before they show up for the Checkride.
This is a really important part, Max. 61129 is our FAR that gives us information about that commercial pilot certificate and the experience that we need. But it's important to note that some of those are total flight time experiences, and some of those are specific to the commercial pilot training. So you're really, unless you're going to do this in a 141 certificate where you can get a little bit of an hours cut down, you're probably going to need a minimum of 250 hours of flight time, and a bunch of that's got to be in an airplane. If we're doing this in an airplane, if you're doing it in a helicopter, some of that would be in a helicopter. We have to have at least 50 hours of cross-country flying. But then we kind of get into the specific requirements for the commercial rating. The FAA does break out. You have to have actually 20 hours of training in the areas listed, and they reference 61.127 Part B at 1 in there. And that's important. So a real big hiccup that we run into for a lot of people on this is a 10 hours of instrument training. Now, this is specific to the commercial rating. A savvy flight instructor might be able to make some of that training from the instrument rating count if you're planning ahead. But if we look at somebody's logbook and it's 6165 training towards their instrument rating, that doesn't necessarily always count towards the commercial. So make sure if you are planning on doing a commercial rating and doing your instrument rating now or thinking about it, make sure you work with your instructor so some of that time will count towards your 61.129 in the future. Otherwise, we run into a little bit of a hiccup where we may not be able to document that instrument training toward your commercial certificate. And another caveat, make sure that's from a CFII. A CFII has to be providing instrument training towards instrument ratings or commercial certificates.
So let's talk about the instrument training. What makes it specific to the commercial certificate? What does the instructor have to do and document so that it applies?
It's really not that complicated if you're thinking ahead. However, what we run into is a little bit of what we'll call sloppy instructor logging. If we're doing an instrument rating and we start, 6165 training towards instrument rating for 40 hours of training towards an instrument rating, in a logbook audit later, it's going to look like that training was all toward the instrument rating. If we're a little bit more careful as instructors and as students, if we watch for this, only 15 hours of training is specifically required in the instrument rating to be toward that instrument rating, even though 40 hours of instrument experience is required. I know this is a little bit of a kind of tight tolerance and a little bit of a nitty-gritty kind of detail here, but if a savvy flight instructor logs 15 hours of instrument training towards 6165, and then in the remaining 25 hours of instrument experience, log some of that as covering the areas of 61.127 towards the future commercial rating, things like navigating and tracking and unusual attitude recovery under the hood are what are going to be required towards that commercial. You can double dip a little bit, but it does take a little bit of diligence from the instructor and the student. If that hasn't been done as an examiner, what I generally have to do is look at the date the individual got their instrument rating and kind of cut it off at that point, and hopefully we can find 10 hours of instrument training beyond that. And really anything beyond that, if you're doing, could hypothetically count towards your commercial rating. If you're doing some instrument currency, if you're doing an IPC and you're receiving training. But many times we find somebody has gotten their instrument rating and then flown and stayed current on their own and never really got 10 more hours of dual training. So they might need to somehow figure out a way to document that towards that commercial certificate. It's a little bit confusing, but make sure that's one of the hiccups if you're looking at your commercial certificate, that you do have that I kind of dotted for us.
Well, I think there's another hiccup that I hear people talk about from time to time. Tell us about some of the long cross-country solo requirements and how people might end up making that not solo.
So I'm going to come back to that 1 second here for you. I want to put one more training hiccup in here, and then we're going to tie this together. Right now, you also need 10 hours of training towards that commercial certificate, either in a complex aircraft, a turbine aircraft, or more recently, we've added a TAA aircraft. Now, the FAA does note that that's any combination. So if you had 5 hours in a G1000 172 and 5 hours in a Piper Arrow with a retractable gear, combined, that's fine. One of the things we're starting to miss, though, is it's a little bit harder for us as examiners. If you say Cessna 172 in your logbook, I don't necessarily know if that 1981 172 is TAA or not. So create some kind of logging process that tells us, if you have a TAA aircraft in your logbook, if that's what you're going to be using to help qualify for that. Now, we have a pretty good idea if you're in a 2020 SR-22 that it's going to meet the TAA. But a lot of airplanes have been updated and modified, and we won't necessarily know that just from the logging. So now, additionally with that, and coming to your question of experience requirements for cross-country, we do have some dual cross-countries that are required for the commercial. There's a day 2-hour cross-country that has gone more than 100 miles from the original part of a departure, and a night cross-country that's 2 hours. Now, these are dual. They do have to be with an instructor. So as we look at that, we then also have some solo experience requirements. One of those is a long cross-country that covers at least 300 miles with a straight line distance with a landing somewhere that's more than 250 miles. It doesn't have to be that you didn't stop in the middle, but you do need a point that's more than 250 miles. And this gets a little confusing sometimes, and the test for us is, what would happen if you had a slow airplane? It's okay if you stop, but you do need a point that's more than 250 miles. And then 5 hours of night flying with 10 takeoffs and landings to an airport with a control tower. Now, during COVID times where we've got a bunch of control towers closed at night, that might be a little harder to find sometimes. So make sure those towers are operating if you're going. But those are solo requirements. Now, where we run into a little bit of a hiccup in this many times, and this is more common in multi-engine that this is used, there's a clause that says, or under DPIC conditions, designated pilot in command, where the flight training operator that you're getting training from doesn't allow you to solo the airplane. They may send an instructor with you, and you are the designated pilot in command, and the instructor is just kind of riding along there to make the insurance happen. You're really doing all of it, but they're along with. So that is not necessarily dual receive time. They're just serving as a DPIC. There are times where people have combined this, especially in the single engine, where we've got an instructor who's bored and says, hey, I'll take that long cross country with you. And we find that they log, 5 hours of a long cross country. And then, because it's late at night, we don't want to get up and stay up too late. And the instructor bails out for that night time at the airports, the control tower, and we find that you got 5 hours of cross country where you were the PIC, but your instructor was with and logged it as dual also. And then you've got that 5 hours of solo with your landings, and there was no instructor with, you did it on your own. Now, there's been some legal interpretations on this, that 10 hours of solo time that includes the long cross country and the 5 hours of night with the 10 takeoffs and landings is an or thing. It's either all solo or all DPIC. So if you're going to take an instructor with for some of it, they have to go with for all of it. Or they have to not be with for any of it. And this is whether it's in a single or multi-engine airplane. These are also not supposed to be what we'll call double dipped in terms of the cross countries with the 2 hour training cross countries, the day and the night ones that you get. So make sure you look at those experience requirements really closely. And if you have questions, ask before you fly that long cross country. I've many, many times come to a check ride and found somebody had the night time that was solo. The instructor took a ride with them on the long cross country, and it nullified the ability for us to get to the 10 hours of either all solo or all DPIC. And it left us with this student needing to refly an experience requirement, which is not only frustrating, but can certainly be very expensive.
So I want to ask you about solo. I hear people debate if they bring along, for example, another person, their wife or someone like that, then the flight no longer counts as solo. True or not?
So technically speaking, that's very true. I'm going to call plausible deniability here. If I look at your logbook and you say, hey, that was my solo long cross country and I flew from, Chicago to Lexington to Nashville and back, and I don't see anything else and it's not logged as dual, I have no way of knowing if your wife took a ride with. Now, if your logbook says took the wife, the dog, the grandkids, and had a great vacation, you kind of left me in a spot where I now know. So in very, very technical terms, solo means the only person in the airplane. It's best to do it that way. If you did happen to do your cross country and you didn't log it with other people in the note section or something, maybe don't mention that to the examiner. Don't put us in that spot. But the best way to do it truly solo is by yourself.
Okay. And I was kind of surprised when you talked about having a designated instructor along. Because for insurance purposes, people couldn't rent the airplane otherwise. Is that the only circumstance under which you could have another person in the airplane?
The FAA does not necessarily get into insurance requirements discussions at all. They do allow that DPIC for that purpose, and that really is about the only reason you're supposed to have another person in the aircraft for a long cross country or a solo requirement. And that's really solo only allowed here in the commercial that we've got that exemption. So it's kind of a unique situation. It's most commonly used with multi-engine training. Less common is that used when we're doing a single engine commercial pilot certificate for experience gaining.
Okay. So when I took my commercial, which was, back when the Wright brothers were flying aircraft, I was not real clear on what I could do when I had my commercial certificate. I thought, hey, I guess I could now fly charter. Tell us about the specific things I can do with a commercial certificate, as well as the things that I clearly cannot do with a commercial certificate.
Max, this is a great way to transition into what are the main differences in the ground portion of this Checkride compared to what really feels a lot like kind of a glorified private pilot Checkride for many of the requirements. Most of this Checkride in terms of what you're going to need to know from a planning and skill and weather-based information are very similar to the private, taken to a little bit different level. We're going to cover weather and we're going to cover some airspace and some cross-country planning, and hopefully you've taken those skills to a little higher level here for the commercial. But where it really starts to differentiate itself is in three major areas. And a big piece of that is, are you really ready to be a commercial pilot? And what does that mean? Does that mean you're able to take charge of an airplane and do the for-hire kind of flying and handle passengers? So that means you need to know what you can or cannot do. And the privileges and limitations of a commercial pilot certificate are a major kind of make or break portion of the ground portion of this Checkride. So in that ground portion, when we're talking about commercial pilot privileges and limitations, we need you to understand first and foremost, I can't go fly for an airline with this. At this point, a commercial pilot certificate is limited to either Part 91 flying, kind of 91 subpart K stuff, and 135 flying. You cannot go fly to an airline, a Part 121 carrier at this point. So, don't call Delta on the first day after that commercial certificate is done. We have now changed that a few years ago that now requires the ATP certificate. So that's one thing you need to know, and it's a pretty simple one for us. Can I go fly for an airline? Nope. But there's a lot of other things you can do. There are some exemptions the FAA gives. It allows you to do banner towing. It allows you to act as a CFI with a commercial pilot certificate. When you have that additional CFI certificate, you could go fly some agricultural things, and you can fly for Part 91 private carriage. So, if I say on a Checkride, George bought himself an airplane, he's not a pilot, can he call you and have you be the hired pilot for that? And typically the answer is going to be yes. Now, if he says, I'm going to go ahead and buy this airplane and then I'm going to put a Facebook page up and we're going to fly anybody, now we run afoul of some of the things called holding out. When it really comes down to it, in most cases, there's kind of a three-part test. Is it available to the public? Is something generating revenue, whether you as the pilot are getting revenue or benefits, and we'll talk about that, or are the airplanes that are being used or airplane, is that generating revenue? Now, could you just say, hey, I want to go fly my friend George and I'm paying for it and I just like flying around? Okay, that's not really necessarily holding out. If you're flying and you're paying for the whole thing, you're just taking somebody for a ride. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, if you're starting to get paid to do it, if George says, I got to go to Chicago and I hear you have an airplane, I'll pay you for the airplane in the day, we're probably running afoul of those commercial pilot carriage items where you need to be flying under a 135 certificate and have some additional FAA oversight and processes that you follow. So it's really important that an applicant understand what they can or cannot do. At this point, you can't take your commercial pilot certificate and become the Uber of the local airspace. So make sure you understand what those privileges and limitations are. That's going to be a major point in the ground portion of this Checkride.
And I'm looking here at part 119.1 because I can't memorize all these items. In addition to the things you talked about, we can also do aerial photography or survey, firefighting, which could be rather exciting, power line or pipeline patrol. So those are those little airplanes that fly low and look for leaks and fly for miles and miles and miles. We can also do nonstop sightseeing kinds of flights as long as we stay within 25 miles of the airport. Now, you talked about charter. If I wanted to do charter, what is required for that?
In most cases, the charter operator is going to have some specific approved requirements. In many cases, they're very similar to what the ATP flight experience requirements will be. However, there are VFR charters out there. So, if you want to go fly and get in that Lear 60 and fly anywhere, anytime in the worst weather possible, it's probably going to be higher experience requirements that the FAA has placed on that charter operation. However, there are charter operators out there that fly in seaplanes, and you might even be able to get a job with 300 or 400 hours of total flight time in VFR conditions. So many of these are kind of a scheduled air taxi service where they may happen under Part 135 operations and some transits. Great examples where this happens is travel between islands down in Puerto Rico. I know of a couple places I even ride on once in a while. Even near my home state up here in Michigan, there's two charter operators that fly back and forth between Mackinac Island and Beaver Island. And their experience requirements, I believe, are like 500 hours and a commercial pilot certificate. And they fly VFR back and forth to get people from the mainland to the islands. So these types of jobs are out there if you do a little bit of looking. I want to add one caveat. The confusion that comes with the local rides and scenic tours, you can, if you want, as a commercial pilot, go out, buy an airplane, and do scenic tours along the beach at your local home. There is one additional piece that needs to be done with that. There is actually an FAA drug testing program that's required if you're going to be doing that. It's a pretty easy thing to set up with your local FSDO. So if it's something you're looking at doing, make sure you're going to do that too.
And if only we could get COVID testing done at the same time. Kill two birds with one stone.
Absolutely. Maybe even for the passengers you're going to take with at this point.
That's an interesting point. I did read about a membership airline which provides testing for the passengers. So all kinds of new
things we're thinking about on the commercial pilot Checkride.
Exactly. New innovative business models. So I'm going to ask you real briefly about the commercial operation. If I wanted to start up my own business and I wanted to start flying charter, how long do you think it's going to take me to get through all the paperwork and get a Part 135 certificate from the FAA?
That's certainly a challenging game, and it depends on how savvy you are with FAA paperwork. We've seen them certainly done as quickly as 3 or 4 months, but many times they're a year to a year and a half by the time people get through the paperwork. And some of this comes down to how much money do you want to throw at it and make sure you got the airplane and the insurance in place and take this gamble and risk ahead of time. That's probably a much longer conversation for a future how do I start my own charter game, but this is something that a commercial pilot would need to know. If you want to do this, it's going to take a while. So I want to hit another spot here, Max. If we're talking about this commercial pilot and we figure out what can we do, a big part of the commercial rating or the certificate that we're going to do in the testing is also kind of an evaluation of, are you really ready to be that commercial pilot? What we're looking for you is to take that knowledge and skill to the next level. As an examiner on the ground portion, I may not say, hey, I would like you to fly to airport X. I might say, hey, I want to go to this city, and you tell me which airport to go to. So I'm looking for you to take that knowledge base to an additional level and help make some of those decisions. Be really the lead pilot for that. So if I say, let's go to Mount Rushmore and take a trip out there because George, who bought the airplane, has hired you to be the family's pro pilot. And, while school's out, a great homeschooling opportunity would be to fly to Mount Rushmore and have a history lesson, right? Well, there's 2 airports out there. So this is where I might put a scenario together and say, pick which one's the better airport for me. If we looked at Mount Rushmore out there's one airport at a higher elevation that has a longer runway. There's one at a lower elevation that has a shorter runway. Well, which one's safer for me to use? This is an opportunity for you to show your decision-making skills, to bring in some performance calculations, maybe think about density, altitude. And lo and behold, when you do all of that for me and plan it ahead, I'll be that bad owner that shows up and says, I brought the cooler and one more kid with too. So can you change some of this and show me how, if you're the commercial pilot, you would manage this? Does this mean you have to dump some fuel, not take a full load? Does this mean you have to say no? And maybe we'll push you to say, geez, boy, I see we got 300 extra feet of runway. That's enough, right? And, are you really going to be the commercial pilot that's going to say, yeah, I'm not going to do that. I need a bigger margin. And how are you going to handle this with a customer that really is paying you to do this professionally? So, when we think about that commercial pilot certificate, part of this is, are you really ready to manage that flight? And as you do that, take into account the things like takeoff and landing calculations and performance information and weight and balance loading. So it's not just going to be as simple as on your private of, hey, show me the weight and balance for today. We're going to give you a little bit more complex scenario and get you thinking about how to be that pro pilot.
And I think the biggest issue that comes up related to that is for pilots to realize that once they're a commercial pilot, they may find themselves in situations where the customer, the person who pays them, wants them to do something which the pilot knows is not safe or maybe isn't legal. And unfortunately, pilots have to learn to step up and say no, even if it means they're going to lose a little bit of money. And I think that's hard, especially for folks who, may be a little tighter on income and finances, to just say no. But sometimes you have to do that.
It's interesting. Even on check rides, I'll push people to that question. Will you say no? Will you say no? And even on a check ride where we're not really going to do it, I'll get people to say, yeah, I guess I'll do it. 300 extra feet's enough. So where are we going to get to in real life at that point? And it's always fine to say no if it's not safe, not legal, because it's certainly better to lose a job than it is your life or your license.
Well, there are a lot of people who have lost one or the other because they didn't say no. So yeah, you got to really keep the big picture in mind. Yeah, maybe you're going to lose a few $100, but hey, you get to live. That's kind of a pretty good trade-off.
The last I checked, dead's still kind of permanent, so we try and avoid
it. Yeah, there's always another opportunity to make a few $100 on a future flight if you have to give up this particular one.
Absolutely. Let's come back with that question, Max, here. And this is kind of one other major difference on the commercial ride, I think, that we take to a different level. On the private ride, we ask you about some of the systems on the airplane and, how do we know if something's broken? Can we fly without it? But we might take that a little further on a commercial certificate and talk about, gee, I see the boss really would like to get home. And here we are at uninhabited Airport X and the right nav light's burned out. And he really wants to get home, so can you fly it home at night or in the day with something inoperative? We're going to take this to a little bit additional level and talk about minimum equipment lists, if we have them, kinds of operation lists, maybe owner and or pilot approved maintenance. So the boss says, boy, the fuel truck just backed into the wing and I ordered an aileron. I'm going to leave you here for a couple of days when here's a set of wrenches and tools and just put a new one on and fly this thing home. Do you know if that's within your ability, or what if it's just a nav light? And this is something that many times owners that I work with, we keep kind of a basic kit in the airplane, some spark plugs and some nav lights and things that, if I find myself on that island in northern Michigan at night and the nav light burned out, well, I can't legally go home because I need it, but boy, I sure as an owner-approved operation could change that nav light and legally fly myself home. So some of these things are things an owner might expect a pilot that they've hired to handle their airplane or somebody working with their charter operation to be able to do. And that's where we're taking that knowledge and skill base beyond just basic things on the private to the commercial level of taking charge and managing those systems of the airplanes and handling if something's not working and knowing the appropriate response for it. I'm not saying you got to be able to change the oil, but boy, if you are a mechanically savvy person and somebody taught you how to do it, maybe you could.
Indeed. Well, let me ask you about the kinds of aircraft that I need to bring with me for the check ride. And that's kind of changed over the years.
The things you have to bring with you, I guess, what things are you specifically thinking of, Max, here? What would you think you need to bring?
Well, I'm talking about the airplane specifically. Past, we had to bring a complex aircraft to the check ride. Do I still need to do that?
You do not. Matter of fact, Max, I'll ask it. So we said TAA aircraft time can count. Do you have to bring a TAA aircraft to the check ride either?
No, I think I have to have at least 10 hours experience in a complex aircraft, but then I don't have to bring a complex aircraft to the check ride. But you asked me specifically about TAA, so I guess I don't know the answer on that.
You're absolutely correct in the direction you're going, though. This is experience you need to have prior to the check ride, but in no way, shape, or form has to be brought to the check ride. You can do that check ride in a 1963 Cherokee or a 1971 172 or whatever it happens to be with basic VFR instrumentation. And there's actually no instrument demonstrations on the initial commercial pilot certificate unless you're doing it as a multi-engine first, which requires one instrument approach under single engine conditions, as simulated when you're transitioning from a private single instrument to a commercial multi-instrument as your initial. Otherwise, we don't have any instrument time we have to do. So a really basic airplane, and this makes your check ride probably a little bit easier than it used to be. And many times in the past, people would show up with a retractable gear airplane, or they would use two airplanes on the test and try and do most of the maneuvers in the 172 and then maybe some maneuvers in the Aero and bounce back and forth. So it's actually gotten a little bit easier in terms of what airplane you need to bring to the test. It also makes it a little bit easier on your training that you can do all of it in one airplane and know that that's what you're going to do all of your maneuvers for that flight test in. Kind of gets you focused on one type of airplane and the limits on it without having to bounce between them anymore.
So could I bring something as basic as a Piper Cub, or do I need something that's got gyro instruments in it so that we can do the unusual attitude recovery?
There's actually no unusual attitude recovery as a required item in the check ride for an initial commercial certificate. Matter of fact, this past fall, I did an initial commercial pilot. It's a single engine certificate in a 1947 Stinson. It was pretty darn cool, and I was kind of excited to do it in a tailwheel because I'm a tailwheel guy. We did a nice job. We had fun, and that airplane did have some more modern instrumentation, but it certainly worked for it.
Well, let's move on to the maneuvers portion of the check ride. And let me ask you, when you start the check ride, what do you end up doing first? Do you do the simulated cross country that you've asked your applicant to prepare before they show up for the check ride?
I'm going to kind of split this a little bit between two different check rides, and there's a general path that people take. Either they go with a private single, instrument single, and then to a commercial single engine certificate, or in many cases, people go to a multi-engine initial certificate first. So we'll talk a little bit about each of those paths because the maneuvers are different. However, on most of the check rides, the first thing we're going to start with is the short field takeoff. Why? Because we're already stopped. We're starting from a taxiing position. It does make it fairly easy to start with that maneuver. If we're doing a multi-engine certificate, we're going to have some different maneuvers that are multi-engine focused. We have, certainly VMC demonstrations and engine failure things that we have to do along the way. If we're in a single engine certificate, we add some maneuvers in there that are not in the multi-engine. We get to do those chandelles, lazy eights, and eights on pylons. In both paths, we are going to have to do steep turns, slow flight, power on, power off, and accelerated stalls and recoveries, and then short field landings, normal takeoffs and landings. The single engine path also includes the soft field takeoff and landing that's not in the multi-engine, and the dreaded power off 180-degree landing. So each one kind of has its maneuver that makes it a little bit, we'll call it challenging. In the single engine, we've got some of those performance maneuvers, lazy eights, chandelles, eights on pylons, and that power off 180-degree landing. In the multi-engine path, we add those engine failure simulations both at altitude and then for an instrument approach with single engine and in the pattern and things like that. So those are really the main maneuvers that we're going to be looking at along the way. In both cases, after that short field takeoff, we're going to take off and we will have assigned you a cross country, and we're going to ask you to start on that cross country typically and find your way along those first couple waypoints and hopefully do so using some pilotage and dead reckoning, not just following the magenta line. If you're just following that magenta line, many times it seems like there's an error and that magenta line will fail, and you'll have to be doing things like looking at the ground and referencing it to your charts. It doesn't always the case, and many times sometimes I will also let you use those resources and then say, hey, we're going to divert. And that is a part of the ACS for both of these also, to see, could you make an in-flight change and divert and come up with some changes. It might even be a simple scenario where I say, hey, George realized he forgot, or he just got a text that he forgot some parts. They're at the airport 20 miles away, and his staff's going to run him over there. So can you go land over there quick and pick him up? So we find some really good scenarios where we might find those diversions, and they're practical things that I've had to do in real life.
Okay, so let's go ahead and stick pretty much to the single engine side here. I think we'll save multi for another day to talk about. Let's see. So landings, some of the short field, soft field, those I guess are going to be to the same standard that we do on the private.
They're actually a little tighter. The short field landing in the private is to 200 feet. Beyond your point, we up the stakes a little bit in the commercial and make it 100 feet. And that power off 180 really has the same standard. So what we're looking for is basically a spot landing. Common error in both of these is ending up short and not doing anything to correct it. Now, the power off 180 is technically a one-try maneuver. It's considered an emergency demonstration. So you've got your landing point plus your 100, and you can't go around. There's a little caveat here that if you need to go around because ATC told you to, if you're at a towered airport or somebody decided to taxi out in front of you, or there were aberrant weather conditions that you could not have foreseen, we can let you go around and try it again. But generally, you're going to have to make this one be right. And to be honest, as an examiner, this is the scariest maneuver you do on the Checkride with me, because people try and force it. They're going to be either slow and low, and they're trying to turn in, and we're making 30-degree banks at 50 feet above the ground, or we're going to be low and we keep pulling back, and we're going to be short, and we're going to stall. This is the maneuver that I most commonly have to engage my piloting skills and help. It's perfectly fine if you go around for safety. That doesn't mean you pass it, but please always make a good, safe decision. Don't force the maneuver if it's not there. Now, in the same vein, if you're long, many people think I can't be short, so I got to be high and long. And that's a little bit fine if you're higher, because you can use something that's also in the ACS, a slip, and demonstrate that skill. But if you're going to be sufficiently long, don't force the airplane on the ground either. It does not work, and we can't pass you if you're going to drive that nose gear on the ground and porpoise us down either. This is a maneuver that you should take sufficient amount of time to practice and get good with, and make sure the day you've chosen to do your Checkride has appropriate weather conditions to do it. Just because your Checkride's scheduled and you really want to get it done and the last 5 times have been bad weather, doesn't mean you should do it on the clear day that's gusting 24.
When you're teaching the 180-degree accuracy approach and landing, any particular tips that you use, and also what would be appropriate or inappropriate weather when you think about this maneuver?
For me, this really is a maneuver that with my own students, if we have more than about 15 knots of wind and more than about 10 crosswind, I encourage them to find a more appropriate day. Or if you have a strong crosswind, there's nothing wrong with telling the examiner, hey, I see the airport 10 miles away is directly into the wind. Why don't we do a couple of our maneuvers over there? And this is, again, is showing that commercial pilot take charge skill, right? If you tell the examiner, look, I got to do a power off 180 and it's, my winds here are 270 at 15 and my runway is a 1836, that's a pretty nasty crosswind. Well, if I take a ride 20 miles away to an airport that's directly into that 27, it might be a much more successful chance at getting that maneuver done. Nothing wrong with taking command of your Checkride and doing your maneuvers in a way that's going to let you do them successfully. When I teach them, I personally keep a little bit higher altitude. And if I need to do a little bit of a slip, I will. That gives me a little bit of room to work with it. And, in real life, in emergency, I'd rather be a little bit long on the runway than end up short in the ditch. So that's kind of how I personally teach it. And each airplane behaves a little bit differently. Some airplanes have a little bit what we'll call slippier wing. And if you get in the old straight wing Aero, it feels like it might go down to that power off 180 in reverse if you really worked at it. They drop pretty quickly. So learn the airplane and make sure you know how that's going to work out on the Checkride day for that power off 180.
And the one other tip I think I would add to that is, I think for both the power off landing and which would of course be for the private, but for the 180-degree accuracy for the commercial, I think people don't think enough about how much headwind they have on the runway, and they don't realize the difference between flying that maneuver on a day when the winds are calm and flying that maneuver on a day when you've got 15 knots of wind. And when people finally start to realize, oh, I have to consider how much wind I have as I'm planning this approach, suddenly that makes a big difference in how likely they are to succeed.
And even taking that a little bit further, left traffic versus right traffic can make a difference. If you're at an airport, many of the check rides I give are at an airport that has parallel runways and a tower, and they may assign you one runway or the other. So if you're used to doing it only with left traffic and they assign you right traffic that day and you've never done one with right turns, it is different. And or if you have different traffic patterns and the wind's blowing one direction, if you're used to doing it where you're turning into the wind versus turning downwind in that turn, that can make a difference and either cause you to overfly that base to final turn or end up short if you're cutting yourself into the wind too. So make sure you're taking those conditions into account as you plan that maneuver.
I think you raise a really good point about the winds on the base leg. Again, I don't think people give that much consideration at all anytime when they fly. And yet I find that when people are overshooting that turn from base to final, it's often because they have a tailwind on base and they never considered that since they're now have a faster ground speed on base, they need to start that turn to final earlier.
Absolutely a true statement.
Well, let's see. Let's talk about some of the fun maneuvers. Let's get ourselves up high in the sky here. Steep turns, what's going to be different versus our private?
Steep turns, we're looking for you not to do much different. It's still really the same standard, except one major change is it does say you're supposed to roll from one to the other. So we are going to be rolling into a left turn and then directly to a right turn. We're linking those in the private. While many people do that, it's not necessarily required. A little pause between them is allowed in the private versus the commercial. Now, where this bites people a little bit is we have two really prevalent methods of teaching this. One is either with trim and one is without trim. Many instructors like to pull that airplane into the bank and then trim to hold that pitch attitude. Now, the danger is when you roll back out between those, if you don't push forward, you may blow your altitude by climbing up too high. So when you're linking those turns, it does sometimes make it a little bit easier to use trim to help you get back to that setting. Again, when you finish it after the second turn, left and right or right then left, whichever side you want to do first, sometimes we blow that altitude going too high. Now, the opposite is if we don't use any trim, it requires a lot of back pressure to hold it there. And sometimes we find people during the turn not holding that back pressure in and decreasing in their altitude and busting the maneuver that way. Now, what's the best way? A little bit of trim is probably the middle ground that we're looking for that takes some pressure off the yoke, but also helps you stay in a position where you can control it. So practice that ahead of time and get used to understanding what the best way for you to make sure the maneuver stays in compliance with the ACS all the way through is.
And what are the tolerances for steep turns on the commercial check ride?
We've still got 100-foot tolerance technically there. Obviously, we'd like you to see you looking for something more like 50 feet. The 89 and a half feet is not quite what we're looking for.
And what about bank angle?
Bank angle, we're looking for closer to 50 degrees of bank angle in there instead of that just at 45. So just a little bit steeper. Now, we also don't want to see you get into 60 or 90 because those G factors start to come up. So make sure you're holding that right at that 45 to 50 degree bank angle for the commercial standards.
Okay, so we're a little steeper, 50 degrees, and that's going to be plus and minus how much?
We're really looking for a plus or minus 5 degrees of bank angle on this. So we don't want to see you rolling it out to 30 on the way through or getting to 55. It's a pretty tight tolerance right at that 45 to 50.
I agree. It is really, really tight. And in terms of the altitude tolerance, yes, I have seen this so many times. If people have trimmed for that 50-degree bank, and when they reverse direction, boy, you can pop up plus 100 feet in probably 5 seconds or less, I would say. It's amazing how quickly you'll bust that tolerance as you reverse from turning left to turning right during the steep turns.
I even I go out and practice them myself, some just to make sure I can keep doing them because that is a skill that needs a little bit of grooving.
Yep, for sure. That's something I think people miss is forgetting that it's going to climb if they put that trim in. Well, let's talk about this steep spiral. That's a really interesting maneuver with all kinds of challenges. Tell us how you teach the steep spiral.
So, Max, I think the biggest advice I can give applicants and instructors on this is don't overcomplicate it and don't try and combine it with other maneuvers. There's a lot of times that have people come and say that, well, I'm doing my steep spiral to an emergency landing in a field. You can, but there's no reason that you have to do that. This is a separate maneuver in the ACS, and it is purely a steep spiraling descent. Now, it's important to understand how your aircraft manufacturer, if there are recommendations, looks for you to do emergency descents. If there are specific instructions given, you may want to look at that. Most of them do not. So this is going to become a question of, do we do it flaps up, flaps down, gear down? Basically, we're looking for an emergency descent that's around a point with a maximum descent rate. Now, I say that because this is many times confused with the separate maneuver, an emergency descent. Now, the steep spiraling descent is a circling spiraling descent looking for a maximum descent rate around a point. So without saying that this is to an emergency landing, the question of why else would we be doing this? Well, there's a few reasons. You might be doing it for spotting in terms of emergency rescue. Maybe you're flying grid patterns for an emergency service and you found the person out there in the tundra, and now we're going to fly a circle around to mark the spot. Maybe back to your firefighting option that somebody could do. Maybe you're marking things for fire. So there are reasons that you might want to make a quick, steep descent down around a point. Now, in our purposes, we're going to pick something and fly that circle and adjust our wind drift around that with our bank and pitch angle a little bit to stay on that point. The biggest challenges we have on this are many times if we have higher winds at altitude and lower winds as we get further down. These are very hard to do if you are going to go do this on a day where at 6,000 feet, the winds are 50 knots, and on the ground, they're at 5 knots. You're going to have to make big changes, or you're simply going to drift off your point. So this is when we're thinking about our check ride. Maybe grab those winds aloft for the day prior to the check ride and think about whether you're going to successfully be able to do that steep spiraling descent. Also, because we do have to have you stay on that point. So this is a part of that maneuver. It's also important to understand this is going to eat up a lot of altitude in some airplanes. Generally, I do not see a commercial pilot single engine check ride that has to do steep spiraling descents successfully able to be completed without a 5, 6, or even 7,000 foot ceiling. And this gets very frustrating if you're trying to get your check ride in. But this is the maneuver that does require typically the most altitude to successfully do. And we still have an altitude tolerance that we have to recover greater than, right? So, if we're losing altitude, we can't recover this at 500 feet. This is a maneuver that we've got to recover, if I'm remembering correctly, still above 1,500 AGL. So make sure you've built in enough tolerance on this that you can get to an altitude, get 3 turns, and still recover with appropriate altitude, so we don't force ourselves into having to issue a disapproval on that maneuver.
Yes, I think I was really surprised the first time I did steep spirals to find out how much altitude one would lose. And I would say that typical aircraft is going to lose somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,500 feet doing those 360-degree turns. So you got to climb up pretty high. And if you're in an underpowered engine aircraft, you're going to spend a lot of time getting up high enough just to go ahead and do this.
And most savvy examiners will give you the opportunity to do the chandelles first, and we'll use that as a way to do some of the climbing on the check ride. That's kind of a trick that many of us use, so we're not just sitting there for 15 minutes climbing either.
Well, we've got a couple other tolerances on this maneuver. We've got to maintain the specified airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, and we have to roll out toward an object or specified heading of plus or minus 10 degrees. So that's pretty tight.
Correct. Basically, pick a cardinal heading on a point and make your circle around on it. And hopefully, after 3 turns, you haven't gotten too low and you've ended up back on the same heading. That's what we're really looking for, with that point you selected still under us or next to us.
Okay, good. You brought up chandelles. Let's talk about the chandelle. Now, that's I guess originally a World War I kind of maneuver that was used by pilots then to gain altitude. Tell us first, what is a chandelle?
So really, the chandelle is just that 180-degree climbing turn where we've got some changing pitch in the first part and some changing bank in the second part, 90-degree separation points between them. And it is exactly that. It's a climbing maneuver where we're going to roll into about 30 degrees of bank and set some climbing pitch. And at 90 degrees of turn, we're going to start rolling that bank angle out and continuing our pitch to get to a little bit shy of basically a slow flight speed, or a little bit shy of the stall speed of the aircraft. And it's a maximum kind of performance climb demonstration. So the most common problems I encounter on this is either people get to that stall speed too quickly. By 90 degrees, I've got the horn going off and we have not any momentum left. Or in some cases, they forget to add power. This is a full power or high power maneuver. There's some allowance in high performance aircraft, but we're going to be adding power and climbing in this. So make sure that we're setting that up, staying coordinated. And as we think about the second half of the maneuver, we say it's continuing to maintain the same pitch as our bank angle is rolled out. That doesn't necessarily mean the yoke position is staying in the same. We do see a lot of people, they start to kind of fall off in that maneuver because they think changing the bank angle while holding constant pitch means keeping the yoke in the same position. But as we lose momentum, we do have to keep adding yoke pressure backwards to maintain what I'll call the deck angle of the airplane, that angle of attack.
So let's go through this really slowly. Let's kind of start from the beginning. I know that essentially this is going to allow people to complete a 180-degree turn with probably the least forward progress. So this, in a sense, this could almost be a canyon escape maneuver if you found yourself in a box canyon.
I think if you talk to a lot of the mountain guys, they'll argue you on that there might be more efficient ways to gain altitude in a tight space. But that's kind of the old analogy that we've used is we're going to make a 180-degree turn and maybe you're in a confined area and you've got to make that climb. Really what we're doing here is just kind of working on aircraft and momentum and mastery. And it is a 180-degree turn where we kind of get that maximum climb out of the momentum and airspeed and power that we have.
All right, so let's talk about step number one. Step number one, we're going to bank, and then we're going to yank, I guess.
Yeah, and this is where we get a good reference back to this airplane flying handbook, right? And I would strongly encourage everyone who's doing their commercial to go through the maneuvers in there because they are specifically described. And this is one of them in there. We're going to start with a changing pitch, but a constant bank angle. That airplane flying handbook says we're going to start with 30 degrees of bank, either right or left. And typically on the Checkride, we're going to ask you to do chandelles to both sides because those left turning tendencies are different with a right or left chandelle. So we're going to ask you to make one to each side typically. So you'll start 30 degrees of bank angle and a little bit of pitch starting to come up as your airspeed is bleeding off. You have that 30 degrees of bank angle all the way to your 90 degrees of turn. So we started on a cardinal reference of west. You're going to start, maybe we'll say left at this point. By the time you get to 180 degrees on that compass or looking outside at your visual references, your 30 degrees of bank will have been held through there. And you should be about halfway through your bleed of airspeed from your maneuvering speed down to your speed that you're shooting for, usually about 10 knots above your stall speed in that configuration. So at that 90 degrees of turn point, in this case, we're using 180 degrees as our cardinal reference. I'm going to continue from there, turning left around to my east, which is where my final is. But as I'm doing that, my bank angle is now going to slowly start rolling out from 30 degrees, and I'm looking to kind of taper that out to end up at 0 degrees of bank by the time I get to east. When I get to that east, I will have held my pitch angle and I should have had the other half of that airspeed differential bleed off and end up somewhere about 10 knots above my stall speed, maybe even seeing a little chirp of a horn or a little chirp of a light, depending on the stall indicator you have in the aircraft. So it's kind of a constant bank angle in the first part, a changing pitch. In the second half, we're changing our bank angle, and our pitch is kind of remaining constant as we let that airspeed and momentum bleed off and end up at whatever maximum level of climb we've gotten in there.
Yeah, and I was just looking here at the ACS, and I had forgotten the very last thing. They say, resume straight and level flight. I always think of this as kind of continuing at stall speed, but I guess we have to, once we reach our 180 degrees, go ahead and level out again. And that 180 degrees, once again, you got to be plus and minus 10 degrees of that heading. So it kind of helps to look and see what mountain or reference is off the left wing when I start. And boy, that better be off the right wing when I finish, or I, might not be on the right heading.
Absolutely. And, even finishing that maneuver, put the detail into it instead of just saying, all right, I'm going to gain my airspeed and diving 300 feet to get your airspeed pushing forward. Take the time to bring yourself to level and then let that airspeed come back up to at least maneuvering speed and a power setting that's back to a cruise setting, especially before you start the right side if we're asking you to do both, because those momentum positions as you start it are different.
Yeah, you raise a really good point because this last item says resume straight and level flight with minimum loss of altitude. So no, you're not supposed to go diving back down again. That kind of goes away from the idea of gaining as much altitude as possible during this maneuver.
Yeah, diving back into the mountain's not going to help us. So,
Yeah, not the way to do that maneuver. Well, let's talk about my favorite. And I say my favorite. I have true confessions here. I've done probably about 10 check rides. And then I finally passed my private. No, that's a joke. No, when I consider all the various ATP check rides and seaplane and you name it, a lot of different check rides, I have only failed one. And it was my commercial. And it was those.
And let me guess, Lazy 8.
Absolutely. They are my nemesis. I'm still battling them to this very day. Talk us through the Lazy 8 and take your time, kind of start from the beginning of the maneuver, describe to people what this thing is, and then talk us slowly through the maneuver.
Sure, and this is, to make you feel better, you're not the only one. It may be one of the more commonly failed maneuvers, and I'll tell you as an examiner, man, a lot of them are ugly that I see. And there's ugly intolerance, and there's certainly ugly out of tolerance, but boy, if you can get these down, they're a cool maneuver, and you learn some momentum, and you kind of feel the airplane, and you might even feel like you made a little step as a pilot if you really get them down. But I'll tell you, as an examiner, I can usually tell in the first 45 degrees of your turn if we're going to botch this or not. It is a very slow momentum maneuver. What these Lazy 8s are is basically a constant changing pitch and attitude maneuver where we have some aircraft mastery, and we really have to manage that momentum. And the reason I say that first 45 degrees is important is we have 180 degrees of turn followed by another 180 degrees of turn if we're linking these together, and during that whole thing we're changing pitch. So if we think about the maneuver in the first 45 degrees, we're going to start on a cardinal heading, we're going to start pitching up, and we're going to start introducing bank slowly. We're not rolling to a bank angle specifically or quickly. Our goal is by the time we've made a 90-degree change in our direction to have gotten to 30 degrees of bank angle while we're pitching up. So I kind of keep this mantra in my head when I'm doing personally these, and it's pitch, pitch, bank, pitch, pitch, little bit of bank, pitch, pitch. So I don't over bank, but I am getting enough pitch in. Now, in my first 45 degrees of the turn, I'm going to get about 15 degrees of bank angle, but I will get a fairly aggressive pitch up, albeit slowly, but I'm going to be getting to a pitch point that's going to bring me, typically 10 or 15 knots above my stall speed. And what that's doing is it's bleeding momentum off. If I'm doing this properly, at that point, if I continue to hold my pitch angle, that airspeed's going to hold, but I'll stop adding back pressure, and I continue to add roll in to get to my 30 degrees of bank. And if I stop adding back pressure and I'm at that speed and I continue to roll, my vertical component of lift is transitioning to horizontal, and the nose will naturally fall. That nose is then going to come from the high position on the horizon to basically passing through the horizon as I have 30 degrees of bank angle in and am passing 90 degrees of turn. Now, the next portion is kind of happens quickly. As I go, let that nose fall, I'm starting to roll my bank angle out and allowing my nose to come down, and my airspeed will start to increase, coming back to what my maneuvering speed was as I come down that second, well, I guess my third 45 degrees, the second half of the maneuver, the first 45 beyond 90 to 135, the nose is falling. It happens probably the quickest of the maneuver, and I'm gaining airspeed, letting my nose dip, and I'm rolling out to 15 degrees of bank by the time I've made 135 degrees of turn. And the last section is what I call the cheater section, where I can start to finesse that last 15 degrees of bank angle out, and I get myself to 180 degrees of turn. And if all goes well, I'm within 100 feet of my starting altitude, within 10 knots of my starting airspeed. And why that's really important is if I haven't done that, my second half of the power off or the second half of the lazy 8 is not going to work because I won't be starting at the proper airspeed or altitude. And then I have to do the exact same thing and link it back to the other side, right? Then left, or left, then right. And it's a slow maneuver and it's a finesse maneuver. And if you haven't gotten that first 45 degrees right, the rest of it kind of falls apart. And you can kind of drive through the maneuver. And I see this, and sometimes this is where the ugly in ACS happens. You can drive through it and we end up within our 10 knots and within our 100 feet. But it's not really the full maneuver that gets the momentum to fall off as we come through that high to low nose position. This is a maneuver that takes practice. I will tell you, it is probably the maneuver that if I look back on a student who's failed it, it's most common that I will see their instructor had failed on their commercial check ride also. It's interesting how we see that sometimes when we'll do check rides for people, and we've had multiple check rides over the years. And if I do their commercial and they botch this, and then they become an instructor and they get through it eventually, and then I see their students, many times their students are weak on it too. It is a challenging maneuver. So make sure if you're teaching this or going to take a check ride with it, you really understand it and work on that process to make these lazy 8s happen. The best advice I can tell you is go slow. This is not a rush. It is a lazy 8. It's in the name, darn it. So think lazy, pitch, bank, pitch, little bit of bank. And if you hear that in your head as you're doing this because you heard this podcast, fantastic. Think pitch, little bit of bank. Nice and slow as you go through those lazy 8s.
Yes, lazy is the word, and that's what I tell people as well. So many of our maneuvers that we end up doing, things happen pretty quickly, and so I think we're probably used to making rapid movements of the yoke to the left and to the right. Wow, this is quite the opposite. This is very small and gentle.
And check ride jitters make you want to rush it too, I'm sure.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Gotta quickly get out of the airplane with that terrible instructor I've got, or no, terrible
examiner. The sooner I get this done, the faster maybe I didn't fail, right?
Yep, exactly right. Well, let's talk about the halfway point here, where we've gone through 90 degrees of turn. So if we were headed north, now we're headed west, for example. The nose was high. The nose is now dropping. You said let the nose drop. I find that I actually have to push it to get it down. Is that what you would expect?
If all's going well, you don't have to push it. And this is where I said you don't have to drive through it. If things have been happening correctly, that first 45 got that pitch up enough, as we continue to roll, the momentum will start to fall. If you hold that yoke position, we'll call it, then the nose is going to naturally fall because you've lost momentum. So if we're having to drive through it, we probably didn't bleed off enough airspeed and momentum in that first portion of the maneuver.
Now, you talked about the last 45 degrees as being kind of the cheater's portion of the maneuver. And I find that, for example, that I have difficulty getting the airplane to continue turning through that last, 45 degrees. And typically, the maneuver seems like it's kind of done 10, 15, 20 degrees of turn before it should have. So I haven't quite made it back to my cardinal point there. Now that suggests to me that maybe I'm bringing the bank out a little too rapidly. But any other suggestions? And why do you call that the cheater's portion of the maneuver?
So I call it the cheater's portion because that's where you can kind of adjust a little bit of pitch down or a little bit of maybe some rudder to help you get to that point, work with that bank angle. This is not something where you're going to adjust power. It's a constant power setting maneuver, but it's the slowest portion. So this is kind of that finesse point where you're kind of sliding it in the spot. Now, if we're ending up a little bit short of our turn, in many cases, this is because we're not staying fully coordinated on this whole turn. We do have to use those darn things on the floor called rudders. So stay with that and stay coordinated, and that will also help the maneuver end up all the way back to that 180 degrees of turn.
So this may be why I focus on teaching the subtleties of glass cockpit aircraft and light jets rather than the subtleties of lazy eights.
Absolutely. And honestly, the best thing I can do with most people to get them thinking about using these rudders is put them in a tailwheel for a little bit, right? So certainly helps out. But yeah, we've got to get this aircraft mastery down. And this is some of those maneuvers that we're doing in a commercial. We're taking those airplane flying skills to a little bit higher level than we've seen in the past.
All right, let's move on to a maneuver that I really actually enjoy and think is kind of fun and cool. And that's eights on pylons. And I'm sure that when people first hear that, they don't even really understand what the heck is that. Talk us through what we need to know to be successful on eights on pylons.
Max, I'm going to start and get you there first with one thing many people kind of forget is a throwaway maneuver. That's the emergency descent. So here we are. We did chandelles. We steep spiraled. We came back up. We did some lazy eights, and we got to get back down for those eights on pylons. Many times the examiner is going to have used that emergency descent to do it. This is a separate maneuver, and I want to just highlight one important piece of this. Some aircraft manufacturers actually have recommended procedures for an emergency descent. The Cirrus is a great example of this. It's a flaps up maneuver at the high point of the operating range, certainly below VNE. Most examiners will be perfectly happy if you do that at the top of the green arc, just to demonstrate that, because we're heading down pretty quick. But we look at the airplane flying handbook, and we have two options to do this. It can either be done in a clean configuration or in a flaps down, gear down configuration if we have retractable gear airplane. In many of the legacy airplanes, there is not a prescribed procedure for this. So you get to choose, and I can't fail you one way or the other. So if you say, hey, I'm doing this in my Piper Saratoga that doesn't have one of these, and I'm going to put the gear down and flaps down, and I'm going to go to the top of the white arc so I stay under flaps over speed range, and that's my emergency descent, that's going to be acceptable. If you say I'm going to do this emergency descent in that same airplane with the flaps up, gear up, and I'm going to do it at the top of the green arc, that's perfectly acceptable. What isn't acceptable is if you say I'm going to do it with the flaps down, gear down, and top of the green arc, because now we've oversped the flaps or potentially the gear speeds. So make sure you understand what your aircraft configuration is going to be and what's allowed for that emergency descent. Typically, it's done where we're going to introduce an emergency descent for some reason. It might be pressurization simulation. It might be that we need to descend because we got an emergency like a fire, and we're going to set the airplane up in a configuration and make a descent. Typically, we do about 90 degrees of turn, not a 90-degree bank, but 90 degrees of turn, basically a little bit of a turn to put people positively G-loaded in their airplane. Think passengers here. How would you keep the passenger in their seat while we're doing an emergency descent? And then roll it out and head straight downhill in whichever configuration you're using. But make sure you know if your airplane has a specified configuration that you should be using. Hey, Max, that brought us down to a really good altitude where we might then sneak down for those eights on pylons that you mentioned, right?
Indeed. And I just want to go back to emergency descent. Big difference in the Cirrus, for example, versus a 172. I find in a 172, when people do the emergency descent, typically full flaps and 45 degrees of bank, maybe you're coming down 1,500 feet per minute, maybe 2,000 feet per minute. Boy, in the Cirrus, any one of them, simple maneuver, the flaps are up, power to idle, push the nose down, do not exceed VNE, which is around 200 knots. We never even get close to 200 knots because I value my eardrums, and we're wailing down at 4,000 feet per minute easily.
Absolutely.
And I have never pushed it to see, well, if I went all the way to 200 knots, how fast would I be coming down? And I'm guessing it's probably closer to 6,000 feet per minute. But man, I don't want to have to go to the doctor and have my eardrums repaired afterwards.
And that's a valid point. If we're demonstrating a 3,000 foot per minute descent rate, that's pretty sufficient. So depending on the airplane you're in, get to a reasonable descent rate. We don't want to see you coming down at 200 feet a minute. But set the airplane up, show us you could do an emergency descent if it's needed is really what we're looking for there.
Well, good. Now we're down low where we can do our eights on pylons. And so essentially we're going to have two reference points on the ground. Each of those kind of simulate the pylon. I guess pylons would be the things we'd see at the Reno air races where people are racing around these things that are sticking up, 50 feet into the air. But we're not going to have pylons set for us ahead of time. We're just going to have to pick some arbitrary point on the ground and then do a figure eight around those two pylons. And I still remember long ago when I was doing these, I was told to go ahead and just pick the first pylon at some point on the ground. And then as I come out of the first half of the maneuver and flying straight for, I believe it's 3 to 5 seconds, if I then turn in the opposite direction, whatever is under the wing at that point becomes my second pylon.
That's a way a lot of people teach this. And interestingly enough, I think the hardest part about this maneuver in many cases is picking the points. I watch people fly for 5 or 10 minutes on a check ride, and don't overthink this. Find a couple points, fly it, and do it. And the best way to think about this is actually, to me, more as turns on pylons that are linked. So build that skill. We're basically taking you from a private pilot level where you could do a turn around a point to now doing a turn on a point. So a turn around a point is holding an altitude, just flying a circle around it. A turn on a point, and the best reason I tell people you might do this is if you got a photographer on board and they're trying to keep that position where they could get that lens and take pictures, we're not looking to have them have to keep adjusting. We're looking to adjust the airplane and keep them so they're looking down the same point. Now, it's a little bit different. We're probably not taking a photographer. We're linking 2 points, but that's basically what we're doing. So we're adjusting a turn on a point. We figure out our pivotal altitude. It's an altitude at which we're going to be able to make that with some change in pitch as we go around. And we're going to adjust that pitch position to hold ourselves on that point while we hold a pretty constant bank angle all the way around it. And then we're going to link it to a second point. So we basically enter on kind of a 45 degree, and then we make one to the left or one to the right, and then back to your 3 to 5 seconds away between it, we should find one to the opposite side. And the most common problem I encounter on this is people are linking turns around a point, not necessarily adjusting that pitch to keep themselves at the point where that wing position is looking straight down at, using that pivotal altitude. And then my favorite is they lose the second point. Or if we go around at one set of those and I say, bring me back around the other one, they can't find their original point again. So set yourself up, know your area, enter it so you can get yourself to those points and use that pivotal altitude. Understand this is a turn on a point linked to a second point. That's why it makes an 8 on the ground. We're linking 2 turns on points, not just holding a constant altitude, flying circles around a couple points.
Well, we should talk about pivotal altitude briefly and explain that. Essentially, if we were flying a circle around a point and we were trying to, as you described, keep the wing right on that point for the photographer, if our ground speed changes, which it will if we have any wind, we're going to have to climb when we have higher ground speed. So the pivotal altitude is going to change the altitude that we need to be at depending upon how our ground speed changes. So essentially, we're pushing and pulling to try and keep that wing aligned with the pylon as our ground speed changes.
That's a good point. And it's also back to the planning your check ride. Make sure you know what the winds are going to be on that day. We get some discussions of, well, is it with the tailwind or with a headwind? And I typically tell people use your pivotal altitude calculation based on what your maneuvering speed is going to be. It's going to be the average of the speed as you go around, depending on what the wind's doing. But you are going to, as you turn into the wind, need to adjust that pitch. And as you turn downwind, adjust the pitch based on what that wind is going to cause you to do in a drift around that point. Again, as we're thinking about check rides, gusting 35 may not be the best day to try and do these ground reference based turns that are bringing you to an 8 on pylon. That turn on a point gets pretty tough to do as we're having to adjust major corrections for wind drift around it if we have significant wind trying to do these maneuvers.
And I'm just looking at the ACS, and it says establish the correct bank angle for conditions not to exceed 40 degrees. We've talked about how we're changing our altitude as we go around our 8. What about the bank? Does that end up changing for us?
So the bank does change slightly depending on what those winds are going to do. You might see yourself vary from 20 to 30 degrees of bank, no more than that 40, right? A little bit of bank angle as we adjust. Again, making sure you stay coordinated using those rudders. And as you adjust that pitch, you either kind of climb to fall backwards, I guess is the best way some people think of. So if we're getting ahead of our point, we need to slow down, right? So we pitch up a little bit. If we're getting behind our point, we dive to catch up to it. And we're adjusting a little bit of bank angle as we come around those points to keep ourselves equidistant. And that's really the main reason for your bank angle change. And then we're adjusting that pitch to stay referenced on the point until we transition to the next one, kind of at that crossing point in the 8.
And I like the way you just described it, and that's why I think 8s on pylons is so easy once you figure it out. If you see that point creeping a little ahead of the wing, push forward to catch up with it. If you just push and pull to keep that point at the midpoint of your wingtip, then it's easy. If you see it start to move a little bit toward the front of the wingtip, push forward. If you see it start to move toward the back of the wingtip, then you're going to pull back. When you do that, it just really makes it easy.
And I think the best thing we can do for these maneuvers as a commercial student candidate or an instructor teaching it is if you just tell people why we're doing it, it kind of clicks. If you say, hey, can you keep that wing on the position so it's out of the photographer's way? It just kind of sinks in after a little while of, oh yeah, I get why I got to do this. If I can kind of use my rudders and my ailerons and a little pitch to keep that wing in a position where the photographer could keep taking pictures of that point, if you think about it that way, the maneuver becomes a lot more natural.
Well, I'm getting excited. I want to go out there and do some 8s on pylons. Anyway, let's talk about slow flight and stalls briefly. Any differences as how those are performed on the commercial Checkride?
The differences are not significant. They're basically the same maneuvers with a caveat that in the stalls, we have one additional one. That's the accelerated stall. And the stalls on the commercial are at the examiner's discretion as to whether they would be taken to a full stall or to an indication of the stall. We certainly hope by the time you get to a commercial pilot that you don't have to get to a full stall to notice it's happening. So one of the things we're testing is, are you paying attention to the fact that, hey, you might be getting close to a stall. So if we're doing slow flight and then we transition to some of the stalls, we might say, do your power off stall to a fully indicated or fully happening stall, so a buffet. Where we might say your power on stall, we might say do it to the first indication that a stall is coming. We might mix it up and switch it back and forth. So make sure you ask if you're doing those stalls, and the examiner says do power off stall for me. Say, do you want it to an indication of a stall, or do you want it to the actual stall and recovery? And typically they'll do one or the other on each one. Now, the accelerated stall is that additional stall that we're doing. And basically what we're doing is trying to get you to show us that you understand that changes in bank angle might introduce a stall. The best, easiest way, it sounds scary when we say accelerated stall, just think turning stall. So if we're climbing and we're showing a turn, we were getting a little bit slow on the climb and then we introduce a little more aggressive turn, we kind of calculate the fact or recognize the fact that vertical component of lift transitions to horizontal and the turn itself increases that stall speed. So that is an accelerating of the stall. Don't overcomplicate. Just kind of get yourself to a good airspeed, pitch up for it, or adjust, and then introduce that turn. The recovery is really simple. It's just a roll down, nose down, and back to a sufficient flying speed. So that is one that many people get a little nervous about. It sounds scary when we say accelerated stall. It's just accelerating the speed at which a stall will occur by introducing a change in that bank, which makes the stall speed happen at a higher point.
Well, the FAA must think that there's something that could be a little bit more problematic with this maneuver versus others because they say has to be completed no lower than 3,000 feet above the ground, whereas many other maneuvers are 1,500 feet above the ground.
Absolutely. And the reason for that is fairly obvious. If we think about what happens in a real stall, we start to get the turn and that leads to a spin. And this is where we probably get to talk a little bit about spin awareness also. We don't test spins on the commercial pilot, but we certainly want to know that you can avoid and properly correct to not end up in a spin. And that accelerated stall is one that is more likely to encounter or introduce a spin. So that's exactly why we've got that a higher altitude there.
And as a flight instructor, anytime I'm teaching any type of stalls, and this not something that I tell my clients, but they're going to find out right now when I reveal this, I am usually mentally walking through the 4 steps of spin recovery, because if they screw it up, man, I'm going to get us out of that spin like that. Now, I'm curious.
I do the same thing as an examiner.
And so when you're giving check rides, how many times have people put you into spins in the past?
Honestly, I have never had somebody on a check ride put me into one. More people, I think, are nervous about them than trying to get close to it. So that's a good thing for all of us. Have there been a couple that have required a little adjustment of, say, rudder or my introduction of some roll or pitch to make sure we didn't get there? Yes. But that's, I'm going to jump in before we get to that point, because if we're heading to the point where we're going to end up in a spin, it's not a successful moment on the check ride.
Well, great. As we start to wrap up here, any other suggestions for people's success in pursuing their commercial certificate and their check ride?
The biggest thing I can tell you is think like a commercial pilot. We're not here to test you as a private. We're here to test, can you go out, safely make decisions, and apply the knowledge needed to fly professionally for someone. We kind of get in the habit as we go through our training of flying with friends and or instructors and thinking there's more senior people that are there to help us make those decisions. We're looking for you to be that person when you're a commercial pilot, because you might be flying in an airplane that the passengers have no idea what's going on other than they're getting in their seat and they want to take a ride to wherever they're going, and you're the hired hand to do it. So, take that knowledge and skill an extra level up to that. And that's really the best mindset to have on that commercial check ride. Certainly, we've got some maneuvers that have some tolerances that you're going to do. But if you think about that all the way through and take it to that pro pilot level, those maneuvers are going to be more successful.
And I still remember when I went out of my commercial check ride, the one that I failed some 20 years ago, as we started taxiing, hadn't even made it to the runway yet. The examiner said, "You're riding the brakes." I thought, oh, okay. And so obviously that's something now I'm constantly looking for in my clients, is to make sure that they are not riding those brakes.
Absolutely.
No point in wasting those brake pads when we don't need to.
I like it.
Jason, where do people find out more information about you, your writing, and how to schedule a check ride with you if they're in Michigan?
All of those things happen at jasonblair.net. Matter of fact, you can actually schedule online if you're nearby and, in the upper Midwest, or, sometimes people talk me into traveling other places. And as we have a little bit more free time these days, my range is expanding, if nothing else, for interest sometimes. Good excuse. And if nothing else, it's a good excuse to get in my plane and fly somewhere sometimes. But all of the writing I do is up there too. We try and put everything up and try and spread all of the information that I can, whether you're coming to a check ride with me or others. I encourage people to dig through my blog and some of the writing. There's no secrets on these check rides. We're just looking for you to do a good job. And if it means you prepped ahead of time by reading things that I wrote or other people wrote, that's just being a good pilot and preparing ahead. So we're not trying to trick you or trap you on these check rides. Study ahead, read things that Max has written and read things that I've written and get that information. And I always like to tell people, until the check ride starts, when I'm asking questions, I can answer any questions you want. So if you've got questions, whether you're doing the check ride with me or others, feel free to drop me an email or reach out, and I'll be more than happy to answer when I'm on the ground.
Hey, quick follow-up here. Back when we were talking about the 180-degree accuracy landing, you called that the one-try maneuver. Do we get extra tries on any of the other maneuvers?
There's a little bit of a caveat here. If you're making good decision making, if you say, hey, I'm coming in for that short field landing and it looks like I'm going to be 200 feet high, and you say, look, in real life, I'm going to go ahead and go around. Go around's part of the test as well. We can call that part of the ACS. Make a good decision. You're showing good decision making. Come around and go ahead and stick that next one. We can't let you go around all day long and try every maneuver over. But if you're making good positive corrections, something was a little bit outside the standard, but you're adjusting for it, the ACS does say constant exceedance of the standards is a failure. A little burble here or there, but you're making good corrections. And you tell us, hey, this is what's going on. I'm correcting, my steep turn, I'm flying around, I'm about 50 feet low, and I'm going to adjust by taking a little bit of bank angle out and add a little bit of back pressure. Sometimes that shows us just as much as if you flew it perfect, because we understand that we're not all perfect pilots either, and making good corrections is part of being a good pilot.
Well, Jason, thanks so much for joining us here for today and helping us all to become better pilots.
My absolute pleasure. Hopefully it helps everyone out there.
And I want to thank Jason Blair for making time to teach us each of the commercial maneuvers. You can find out more about Jason and his books at jasonblair.net. And if you're anywhere near Michigan, you may want to schedule a check ride with him. In our show notes, you'll find links to Jason's website, his page for scheduling a check ride, and his YouTube channel. And if you found value in this show or any of our shows, please support us with just a small donation through our Patreon page at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Or if you have a PayPal account, you can make a one-time or monthly contribution through PayPal at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And when you do, we'll read your name on the show. So please consider joining the just 3 to 4% of listeners who support the show. And don't forget to tell your friends about the show, because that's how we get most of our new listeners, when people like you tell a friend about the Aviation News Talk podcast. And if they don't know how to find a podcast, it's easy to just send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, where they can download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast app for iOS and Android. In the App Store, just search for Aviation News Talk. And yes, those apps are totally free. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.